Um, Gypsy, the artist statement on your website includes the following statement. One of the most imperative functions of portraiture is to increase our capacity for understanding and empathy. Do you recall how you arrived at the power of portraiture to increase empathy and understanding?
Yeah, this is crazy. Have just been thinking about this lately because I am about to teach portraiture in a figure drawing class that I'm teaching right now, and not, I don't think you have to like re-emphasize how important portraiture is, but I do think that like right now culturally, it's really very important. I remember when I was young, in childhood, maybe having conversations with people, family and friends, maybe when I was about 10, I don't know, we'll put an age on it. There was a lot of conversation about um, eye contact and what makes a person trustworthy in terms of eye contact. And that was mixed in with conversations that were, I think, both consciously and unconsciously within a racist connotation, right? Like when I grew up, I understood very much that it wasn't, I was sort of inadvertently told that I wasn't supposed to look at people directly from other races. And I also was told that it was disrespectful to not look someone in the eye, right? And so I grew up with this really conflicted conversation about that I didn't agree with, but was just sort of circulating within culture that, and there, I'm getting to my point here, I promise, but we culturally, all in this country, there's all these different cultures, and we have all these different rules about social grace and what we're taught about who we can look at, who we can't look at, who we're allowed to have a conversation with, who we're not allowed to have a conversation with. And I think in terms of, if you break it down into black and white, there are very different rules, right? And so I grew up understanding that it was like this social contract, whether or not I could really look at somebody for a long period of time, right? Don't stare, right? That's what we're told sort of when we're little kids. But at the same time, I didn't really understand the complexities of that. And now I really do. I understand that in order to connect with people, we need to look at people a lot more than we do for eye contact to really regain our sense of humanity with each other, but also to get past our biases and our assumptions and our history that we're brought up with. If you've done any drawing, painting, that, or sculpting, or any kind of observational reaching to understand something, you don't really see anyone or anything unless you stare at it for a really long time. What you're seeing through is your filter and your assumption about what it is you think you see. And until you stare at something and, in my opinion, try to draw it, try to replicate it, you don't really know what you're seeing because it's all in your mind, right? And so to really look and reflect and look and reflect and look and reflect, man, we're at a point in society where we really need to look at each other for a long time, to create more empathy, to create more true understanding of each other, not the understanding that we think we have in our heads, but an actual true understanding of who it is, what it is someone else looks like, who it is someone else is, what is their story, not what is our story about who they are. Yeah. I don't know if that made any sense.
Oh no, it's great. It's great. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. It felt very appropriate for the show, so I wanted to make sure I asked about it. So when it comes to portraits, what artists have inspired each of you? Is there a particular style of portrait painting that you are really drawn to?
Matias, go ahead.
Um, I mean, always, I've always kind of gravitated to faces. I mean, I think a lot of us do, right? It is like it is the location of identity on a person, right? Like how do you recognize someone? Their face or right fingerprints. But we usually don't look at each other's fingerprints to figure out, who I'm talking to. So I think that on some level, like portraiture has like a kind of like direct, like just a draw to it. As far as the people who I look at who have really inspired me, Francis Bacon, huge, you know, just incredible, the use of paint, just the way he talks about his work, you know, he is like, for me, he is like the god, you know. From there, I've always been very interested in like, you know, I love mark making, so it's like abstract expressionism, de Kooning, and then more, you know, moving farther back, you know, like the old expressionists, like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Egon Schiele, and then of course, like I said, the impressionists, and especially Degas and Manet are just genius portrait artists. And then, you know, like as you go even farther back, like the other god of portraiture to me is Rembrandt. You know, just these portraits that, especially in his later life, they are very loose, really. You know, like a hand is described with just a couple brush strokes, which is, you know, always a very exciting thing, because I feel like through that gesture, you have like the time between me looking at this painting and him making a mark 400 years ago or 350 years ago, like it just collapses, and I am there seeing this movement happen in real time almost. But those are like the major portrait artists that I look at and that inspire me. Today, Jenny Saville is a brilliant portrait artist. Just absolutely wonderful.
What about you?
Yeah, agreed on the Jenny Saville. One of my absolute favorites, man. Just in terms of a painter too, you know. I mean, she could paint a fence post and I'd probably want to look at it. And you know, I echoed a lot of those. Egon Schiele for sure, huge influence. Gosh, Rembrandt. You look at just his self portraits. He did what, over 100 within his life, and you can see his full lifespan. You know, through who do we get to do that with? You know, Velasquez, because he painted so many different kinds of people, and he was such a classic master too. And then another one that I look at a lot these days is well, a couple. Anne Gale. I don't know if you know who Anne Gale is. Just purely portraiture, very boundaryless. And oh gosh, John Biggers as well. John Biggers is more of a drawer than a painter, but John Biggers just used mark making and portraiture in such a fantastic cultural and painterly way. Even though he didn't paint very often, he did more. And then, oh, you know, you could go on for a long time. Archibald Motley Jr., another one that I was really inspired by. So, yeah.
Cool. That's a good list. I can't say I'm familiar with them all, but now I've got some great artists to look into, so I love it. So Gypsy, I was looking at the pieces of yours that will be in the show. There are two pieces with similar titles, and they have a similar technique. The titles are "I Will Not Be Contained" and "I Will Not Be Caged." And the technique is that the clothing sort of blends into the background. And it's really sort of eye-catching and it's intriguing. It made me really want to look at the pieces closer. Why did you choose that technique? Was there a conscious reason why? Did you make a choice to do that, or was it something that just sort of naturally came to you?
Well, that's a great question to ask right after the influences, because I don't think it was a conscious reason. You know, it's funny because I don't know if many artists can really say, "Oh yes, I thought of that on purpose and it was very intentional." Like, we have so many influences that infiltrate our brain and they just come out. And I think it's also part of the bigger zeitgeist, right? A couple of influences that I had been looking at the time through research for my classes was Kehinde Wiley and crap, I can't remember the other guy's name, but another person who, and Gale kind of fits into this too, where Kehinde Wiley really, he takes his background and he interrupts his figures, overlapping or underlapping in all different kinds of ways with lots of different patterns. And Philip Thomas is another artist who does this. He's from Jamaica and does portraiture. And I don't think I wasn't consciously thinking about that when I was making those pieces, but I think the idea was sort of stuck in there. What I started that idea with was that polka dot shirt that I had, which was a shirt that I just wore all the time. And it was sort of this weird shirt because it was pink and orange, which is two colors that I don't know, don't necessarily go together. And I started to just paint the painting straight, as in just like it was. And then I would, in my drawing, you know, whenever you draw circles, even if they're partial, you draw the whole thing so that it feels fluid. So I started to draw the circles outside the edges of my shirt, and I was like, ooh, look at that. It was an accident.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, oh, and then immediately I was like, oh yeah, let's do it more. And then my wife, the other painting, I Cannot Be Caged, or I Shall Not Be Caged, I can't remember, but she has this great dress that has these birds on it. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do the same thing with the birds, you know? And we were both, this was during quarantine, where we had lots of time to think. And we were both very much just thinking about who we were and, you know, self-contemplation. And then I was very much thinking about, you know, cross-dressing and who do I present myself to the world as. And so it just seemed like a great metaphor, both of those situations. Yeah.
Very cool. I was wondering, you know, you've done some really wonderful mural work, and I thought, oh, I wonder if this is something that came from the mural work, or were you thinking about that at all, or was it just, you know, an idea that came to you, like you mentioned, and kind of just went with it?
It goes back and forth, you know, the commercial work, the mural work, and my own work, they influence each other definitely. You know, scale wise, gosh, to paint a mural and then you go back to a little tiny canvas and you're like, no, this isn't big enough. I want to bust out of the box. Definitely, I'm always interested in that. And then, you know, another artist that's influential is Julie Moretu, who does these like 20-foot by 20-foot canvases. You know, she has to rent out warehouse space in order to stretch her canvas, you know. So I'm just, it's like, you know, the dream of, right, what I would like to do. But then I think also, you know, non-traditional medium too. When you're working with a mural, you got to work with a lot of mediums that aren't necessarily archival, right, in the traditional painter's sense. And so there's always, yeah, mush back and forth between, because, you know, you go back to traditional painting, and if you have a traditional training, your training says, oh, you can't do that. But then the other part of your brain says, well, why not? You know, so break the rules.
Matias, many of the portraits for the show, they have a large dab of paint in the center of the face. But even with the dab of paint, when I look at it, it seems like it's a very, I still feel like there's a real strong personality to it. And like something very detailed is captured, despite there not necessarily being really clear facial characteristics. And I wonder if there's, why that is that you put the dab of paint oftentimes in these pieces in the center of the face, and if you're looking to capture something aside from the facial characteristics.
Well, if there are, if like the dabs of paint more frequently than not end up towards the center of the face, it's not anything intentional. I strongly believe in trying to work with an element of chance, right? Like using like very fluid paints, sometimes throwing paint, you know, being very gestural, scrubbing things out when necessary, or when not necessary sometimes, you know. But, you know, it's like, it's really kind of a process of like hitting pause when it's like, aha, okay, this is like, this is where it should stop, you know, like I don't know if that exactly makes sense, but it's not like an intentional thing of like, and to finish this off, one splat of paint right in the center. But I do know what you mean, because I think that a lot of the time there are these kind of like gestural marks that how exactly they don't become part of the image, right? Like it stays being paint. Like, okay, it's like, okay, we've got an eye here, but then there's like a splat of paint. And I think this comes from, first of all, just my love of paint itself and like how it just physically is, and the brush strokes, and you know, it's so evocative in itself, but also you know, the materiality of it kind of, I've always really liked looking at other pieces where I can like see artifacts of how it's been made, essentially. Because like I said with the you know, that comment about like the Rembrandt, like the brush stroke, you know, like you're right there experiencing the movement of the brush. It's kind of the same thing. Like when you can tell how it's been made, you can almost re-experience it along with it. But I do think that there's another aspect of your question that's very interesting. There's like the swirlingness of a lot of these. And there was a for my senior show, there was a quote by the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus that I stole. Well, I didn't steal it, you know, I attributed it to him. But you know, he wrote in fragments, and most people probably know him from like the to paraphrase, like the "you can't step in the same river twice," you know, or I think it's like different waters flow through the same river, right? Like, you know, these ideas of flux were very important to him. And the one that I really liked was he was talking about this ancient Greek drink called posset, which a very weird thing, but essentially is like a vinaigrette where there's like an oil component and there was like a liquid, you know, like more like watery component. And so it would need to be whipped up like an emulsion for it to be suspended, right? Or else it separates. And so his fragment goes, the posset stands still when it is moving, right? And I think that this is a statement of identity. When it is moving, it is not one thing. Or sorry, when it is staying still, it isn't one thing. It becomes two separate constituent parts. But when it is in motion, its identity as a single stable, standing still thing can be. So I think that is the other part of why these pieces are the way they are, because I think it is more true to reality to have them coming together or falling apart, depending on how you see them, than to have you know, like to recreate what I'm seeing here on our screen of us, right? That's a totally subjective value judgment, right? But that's, you know, it's trying to get to something like very visceral about like being a person.
That's really interesting. Definitely when I look at your pieces, to me, I see like what feels like a lot of movement in a still image. And so there's something that's like that idea of, I forget the name of the drink, but that it's really only itself when it's in motion or when it's moving. It does feel somehow related to your work. Like I can see that in your work somehow. So that's cool. I like.
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you hear anything that I said? I think I accidentally muted myself.
No, yeah, we could hear you. Yeah,
you're good.
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
it was
great.
Thank God you don't gotta go through that.
Yeah. It's like, my God, is that microphone button red?
Zoom anxiety.
um,
That's a subject of its own.
Gypsy, a question for you. Aside from the 2 paintings that I mentioned earlier, there are 5 paintings in the exhibit. And something that I noticed about the figures that were painted in the exhibit was that their shoes, to me, really stood out. So, one subject is wearing kind of like distinctive white low tops that are sort of pointed towards the viewer. And another is wearing pink boots. Another is wearing polka dot boots. And I think even in one, there's sort of like ridges around the boot that sort of feel like visual waves or something. So I guess I was wondering, did you intentionally feature footwear when you were doing that? Is that something that just happened, or what was the thinking behind that?
Okay, well, this is another one of these conscious, unconscious things. The short answer is I'm a shoe whore. I love shoes, but and so that was probably the unconscious part. Like I have too many. If I have too many of anything, it's probably shoes because they're like jewelry, you know. But I think that gets at the other thing that I'm interested in, which is, you know, I guess you could label it as fashion, but it's self-expression within how do we present ourselves, right? That's a big part of the identity conversation these days is how do we go out in the world? And that's, I think, an issue for people who need to think about it. You know, sometimes we need to think about it more. Sometimes we need to think about it less. I'm aware of that as an LGBTQ person and as a person who may possibly get mistaken for the wrong gender. And in some situations, that's fine. And in some situations, that's quite dangerous. I can cite, of course, many examples. And I think that any marginalized person can talk about that experience of, you know, sometimes your identity is not about who you actually are. It's about how other people perceive you, you know. Like when I just went through the airport a few weeks ago and mask on, I'm a man. Mask off, I'm a woman. I don't know what that's about, but that's what the whole, like, it was very consistent. And so I think where I started to become interested in clothes, which was a new thing for me, because I love to paint the nude figure. I love to do that. I think, you know, the nude body is beautiful, but what I started to realize as I became aware of this contextual presentation that people go through, and everybody goes through that, even as a teacher, the way that I present myself to my students makes a huge difference as to how they perceive me and who they think I am and what kind of authority figure I am or not authority figure I am. And so I started to really notice this with transgender individuals in particular. When you come out as trans, your clothing is the first thing that you change that communicates to people who you are or who you say you are. It is also the thing that puts them at risk immensely, especially if they don't pass. And then even if they do pass, if they're found out, you know, the way they present themselves, it's a huge conversation. Occupies a huge part of my brain that I don't always want it to occupy, but it is something that I have to think about. So I started to observe, you know, I started with transgender individuals and observing, you know, we're not supposed to label people necessarily as brave anymore, but it sure as heck was brave there and still is to dress as fabulously as you want to dress. I mean, that's one thing I just was like, holy cow, look at all this great, brave, bold, I guess is a better word, bold sense of fashion. And I wanted to do it myself, you know, but to do that is drawing attention a bit. And so that's a risky thing to do sometimes. And so it becomes part of the shoes, any part of the clothing, like the series I think that I have in there of Riley was one of I did a series of Riley because Riley, I would love to look at Riley's closet. I mean, Riley just dresses to the nines, you know, like a fashionista from New York City every single day, you know, faux furs and fishnet stockings and all the boots. I don't even know, you know, whatever. But I just was like fascinated by this whole sort of. It's not a new trend by any means. One of my major influences was Romaine Brooks, who's a painter from the 1920s who lived primarily in Europe, but was an American painter and moved to Europe because a gender fluid lifestyle was much more acceptable then. And Romaine Brooks painted gender fluid people within that time period. One of the first that I've found within traditional Western painting. You know, so yeah, I could go on about that for longer, but that's the shoes. Yeah.
Matias, I noticed on your Instagram that you've done some sculpture work, and it seems to me like your 2D has sort of a dimensionality to it that reminds me of sculptural pieces. Does your 2D work and your 3D work, did they affect one another?
Yeah, yes, probably, but I actually don't do very much 3D work. I would like to do more, and the studio space that I work in right now has a kiln, so it is an option. I you know, I just haven't taken as much advantage of it as I ought to. A lot of the stuff from my Instagram was done in a hand building class that I took at MSU during COVID, which was an interesting thing because it was a virtual sculpture class.
Oh, wow.
But because of it, you know, I got very enamored with these, like, you know, making like little figures out of clay. But unfortunately, I cannot really speak to like the dialogue, if you will, between the 2D and the 3D work. Although I would really like to do more, because, you know, also I think that, you know, sometimes you make something really cool and it's like, well, gee, maybe I should paint from this little sculpture that I've made, you know, because I love cannibalizing my own work. It's always a wonderful source of inspiration.
Speaking of cannibalizing your own work, kind of leads nicely into the next question, which is when I went to your Instagram, I saw you did this, you have these amazing reels where you have sort of an extended session of you painting and working. And you did this thing that I've never seen anyone do before. I don't know if it's common, but essentially I think you sort of found a part of one painting that you liked a lot. I think it was like a leg, and you put cellophane over it, and you painted the leg again on top of the cellophane, and then put a canvas to the side of it and sort of flipped it over onto the canvas, and sort of, I don't know what the sort of carbon copied it onto another canvas.
Yeah.
So some really cool stuff that you're doing on there. And I'm wondering, I know this show's about identity. Social media, obviously, identity is a huge part of that. And I'm wondering if social media has affected the way that you do your work or the content of your work, and potentially if that relates in any way to the way that identity has worked into your work.
Yeah, I mean, short answer, has it affected how I do my work? Yes. You know, just like an atom bomb going off, honestly. I think I have very ambivalent feelings about social media. I think that it's obviously it's got like really cool potentials, and it opens up a lot of really positive possibilities, right? Like, I think for one thing, the current explosion in like awareness of social issues, like you know, things like Black Lives Matter, things like just the huge explosion. I don't want to keep exploding things, but, you know, the boom in visibility of trans and non-binary and just like, you know, queer people, gender non-conforming queer people in general, in our current moment, is in no small part because These people are able to connect with each other over social media. You know, like you don't, it was much harder. It was much harder before social media to be part of the queer community, you know, like you had to, you had to be doing like the Tom of Finland shit, like, excuse me. But you had to be doing like Tom of Finland stuff, like you're going out cruising, like, or like cruising, Al Pacino, right? Like, what does the handkerchief mean in the back pocket, right? Are you the passive or active or whatever, right? There's all these coded things where like you really in most cases needed someone from that community to bring you into the community, and that's this is where like discussion of like queer elders is like like where they are like a very important thing within the community. I mean, they still are, elders are still an important thing in the community, but they had a different functional, importance, an almost gatekeeping importance previously. Now everything is different, right? We can connect to each other just boom online. This is a good and beautiful thing. However, incels can also connect with each other, right? And like you can essentially just connect with anyone who has any belief that you share, no matter how founded or out pie to the sky. There are other people who think that, and it can kind of like feedback itself. Now, how does it affect me personally? I think that there is something like it's really good to be able to like get your work out there, because we make this work to be seen, right? But when I've done like streams where I'm filming myself paint, it's really weird. It's really, really weird. And I even like, I used to I would hang out with friends, and like towards the end of high school, we would get together and we would like go to my garage, or my parents' garage. And late at night we would smoke a bunch of pot and hang out. And I would paint, and people are watching me, but there's something so different about putting a camera there, because the camera isn't one set of eyes. It is everyone, right? Anyone can be watching right now. And there is something very unnerving about this. And I think that it does create a kind of environment where it's really hard to be authentic or to know what authenticity is. And I'm going to double back to the positive ambivalence here. I think that there are ways in which this is a really good thing, because I don't think that people are like peaches, where there is like a pit at the center where, if I just keep digging, I'm going to know who Matias really is. There isn't a Matias. It is all in flux, right? I think this comes from the fact that like how we understand ourselves is socially affirmed, right? Like I were talking about with dressing, right? You present certain ways, and so you're treated certain ways. And this is like a feedback loop of like, you then adjust how you present to how you're treated, etc. And social media has made this way more evident in terms of its, from the perspective of authenticity, in terms of its shallowness. But I think that it also kind of reveals that there is something real there as well, right? That there's a realness beyond the idea of like a true authenticity, if that makes any sense. I don't know. It's a really contradictory statement to end on, but I don't know. That's one of these. This is a very ongoing thing that I've been thinking about, because we are like drowning in social media right now. So it's really hard to like be a fish in water and be like, damn, what do I think about all this water stuff?
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, what you talk about with sort of not being able to get to the center of the peach, it kind of reminds me of what you said earlier about what was it called? The drink was a posit?
Posit. Yeah.
Posit.
Yeah.
Okay. Sort of about that posit is that like it's the motion that makes it what it is. It's sort of the constant movement that does it. It's not necessarily a stable, fixed thing. And it also seems like that's sort of the idea with social media and this constant feedback loop of what I think you were trying to say, which was sort of like, you know, we're constantly adjusting to the way people react to us, and then people are adjusting the way they react to us because we've adjusted to the way they react. And so it's this constant movement back and forth.
Yeah, social validation loops per se.
Cool. Gypsy, what about you? Do you feel social media has affected your work at all?
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, it can't, if you're involved in it, I suppose even if you're not involved in it, it's gonna influence, you know. It's interesting to try to students ask for, how am I supposed to use this? What am I supposed to do with this? You know, because there's lots of different points of view on how you're supposed to use it. And you know, gosh, that whole conversation has my head swirling a bit. You know, just to backtrack a minute, I really think the splotch of paint on the face is brilliant in terms of referring to, you know, when we look at a picture of ourselves, right, and a still picture, not a video, but even now I think that's translated to a video, a snapshot, if you will, right? We look at that as ourselves. We look at that and we go, "Oh, that's not who I am." It is who I am, but it's not the complete picture of who I am, right? And we never have a complete picture of who we are. And so I think that we often think of that in terms of assessment, right? You know, assessing our worthiness or our beauty. You know, our beauty is in our movement. It's in our actions. And our worth is in our movement and in our actions. It's not in something that we capture. You know, maybe that's our way to try to get at immortality, right? But that's an illusion, right? And we're so trapped in this illusionistic world, and I think as artists we're very conscious of that, you know, because we're presenting, it's a representation of who we are. It's not actually who we are. And so to how like we never have conversations in class long enough to really get at some of this stuff. You know, it's more about how do you use it as a tool. I think gosh, you know, the implications of it culturally in reference to worth, there can be, it's like a tool. Either something can be a tool or it can be a weapon. And I think I try to be really conscious about how I interact with social media, how I present my work on social media, as how do I be a tool to be useful or helpful. And it's such a hard thing. We attach ourselves to it so much. You know, how do we not use it as a platform to tear each other apart or tear ourselves apart? You know, good God, you know, it depends on what kind of, you know, moments you've had on social media, right? I've had all kinds, and at this point I'm trying to think, well, how do I use it as a tool to be useful? Because like Matias said, you know, gosh, so much potential, and such a great platform, you know, if you're an artist who's trying to gain visibility or have conversation, or, you know, I'm super into storytelling, oral storytelling. That's what portraiture and painting is to me too, as well as storytelling. You know, how do we're all just dying to tell our stories. You know, there's how many people have lived their whole lives and never been able to tell their story or felt validated or seen. You know, I think that's the core of what we're trying to get at, is how do we feel seen even by ourselves, I guess. You know, pretty deep answers you're getting for for such a simple question.
That's a great answer, and definitely feels pertinent to this show. So I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much. I know we've gone a little bit longer today. So Gypsy Schindler and Matias Brimmer, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we wrap up, I don't know if there's anything either of you want to promote or add. I didn't mean to cut anyone off if there was a final thought.
I feel like I'm saying Matthias's name wrong. How do I say it?
It's Matias.
Matias. I wanted to say it wrong. Dang it. Okay, Matias. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Most people do the first time.
Okay.
Cool. Well, Gypsy and Matias's work will be part of the Rendering Identity show that runs at ACWL-Nuveen from April 28th through June 10th of this year, with a closing reception on June 9th from 5 to 7 p.m. Both Matias and Gypsy will be at this event to give an artist talk, and we are super excited to both show your work and to hear you guys and see you in person. We're really excited for that. So thanks for taking the time to meet with me today, and we will see you in April.
Right. Thank you, Ian.